So folks, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to give you some overviews of where we're at in the macro economy and in the Bay Area economy and some things to think about that economists are watching very closely. It just so happens that the labor market data for the Bay Area and California are going to come out while I'm talking today. They're going to go out at 9 o'clock PDT. So after I'm done, if you hear the news should start to pop on the internet where what unemployment rate we've actually hit in California, but a lot of it is just about jobs and how many jobs we're actually going to lose. So it's very disconcerting in the sense that we're very concerned about how long and how deep this recession is going to be. And I'm going to show you some forecasts that suggest it's going to be deep, but not that long. It's just going to be, because it's so deep, it's going to take a long time to get back to where we thought we were going to be. And so a lot of questions I get is this the Great Recession repeated? Is it the Great Depression? Is it something in the middle? Is it something that's less than the Great Recession? I'm going to try to show you some forecasts that suggest it's something less than the Great Recession, but a lot depends on how we open our economy back up and ultimately how much business capacity have we lost as a result of the shelter in place. And at the end, we're going to talk about the future a little bit. And I'm going to stop at certain points and let us interact a little bit about what I've said and get your views on where you think things are going at salient points in the presentation. Okay, so folks, it's been a tale of three policies. Monetary and fiscal policy have become as expansive as we saw at the end of the Great Recession. So one of the funny things about this situation is that instead of sort of seeing the pain, watching it evolve, waiting for the acute pain, and then reacting, the pain came so quickly that policy reacted very quickly. And so once we open up our economy again, monetary and fiscal policies, lower interest rates, and all the federal stimulus we've heard about should start to act with each other to provide a pretty good boost to the economy. But until we've actually ended the social policies, which are a large negative and a drag, we won't know how that's going to work and if they're going to work synergistically. But in theory, we expect larger outcomes on the positive side from these policies in combination than we expect from the negative piece. And these are why the forecasts are starting to suggest that we're going to see maybe 2021, 2022, some sort of basically back to business as usual. But at that 18 to 24 month stretch is still a relatively long time, especially since we're kind of living week to week, given what all the consternation with shelter in place. One piece of data we've been watching very closely are what we call the new initial claims for unemployment insurance, because these data are actually point counts of people who walk into the unemployment office and say, okay, I've lost my job. I would now like my benefits. And so this is actually the quarterly average because it's so episodic. You don't want to look at it on a week-to-week basis. But if you look at it on a rolling quarterly average, it's still very, very wild historically speaking. This is from 1986 for the U.S. And you can see the wild movement on the far right-hand side. And here are the last three recessions to provide some contrast. So at the national level, and these are the most, this is just through the 9th of May. You can see how small the movements were in the last three recessions against what's just happened in the last 8 weeks, which is the far right-hand side. Now, there is some good news here, believe it or not, even though this represents about 30 million people who've lost their jobs so far, is this. You can maybe see it's a little bit more thick than the other parts on the right-hand side. Why? Because in the last couple of weeks, we've actually seen it peak and start to fall back on a quarterly basis. And when that happens, historically speaking, it suggests that the unemployment rate rising is going to peak sooner than later. So until these claims stop rising, the growth of unemployment is going to continue. But since they've stopped rising, it suggests we are actually going to be able to see the peak sooner or later, maybe within 10 months. But here's another way of looking at that historically. So this graph from 1976 forward links the two data sets together. The black is the unemployment insurance claims. The blue is the unemployment rate in the U.S. before this started. So all the way from January 1976 to February 2020. And you can see that when the black line peaks, and I'm just going to show you the last three shaded areas in recession. You can see the black line peaks, then unemployment peaks after. Peak, 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 peak. So the speed at which this has happened is different than the last three recessions in the sense instead of having this somewhat of a hill climb and then go the other side of the hill, this is like a rocket ship straight up, but we're not expecting the rocket to just kind of fall out of the sky. We're expecting it to kind of curve and slowly descend as people are rehired and come off of unemployment. However, that peak being reached is key because as people start to come off unemployment, unemployment rates stop rising and start to fall again, and our economy gets back to where it basically wanted to be in the first place. But that could be a much longer time period than the time in which we ascended. GDP data came out. When we talk about the actual dating of recession, these data are key. So let me show you. This is from 1990 forward on a quarterly basis. The far right-hand side shows what we just learned about the first quarter of 2020. So that was just the beginning of the pain. If you notice, I'm going to show you these three shaded areas again. The last three recessions are shown in those shaded areas. And you can see in the Great Recession, the third shaded area moving left to right. The most negative quarter was negative 8.2. We just had one that was negative 4.8. I'm going to show you in a minute what the current forecasts are for the second quarter, where most of the pain, economists have sort of rallied around this point, is going to show its face. But you can see there were a couple of negative quarters before we got that really nasty quarter, meaning that the economy was sort of stumbling, tumbling, finally fell to its depth, and then started to get back again. But whether or not we have a deep fall and then some positivity after that is one of the biggest questions out there right now that equity markets, labor markets, and economists all over the place are watching very closely. But think of it this way. We are starting recession, and usually it takes 2 quarters in a row negative to start the idea that a recession has happened. I don't think there's any doubt we're going to be in a recession. But the key is how we come out of this cycle. So one thing to watch is how consumers and businesses continue to spend. If you break down why GDP fell, most of it was because consumption contracted, and that makes a lot of sense. We stopped buying as much stuff as we normally do. Where economies get into a lot of pain is when consumers and businesses stop spending simultaneously. So notice, I didn't shade this yet. I'm going to actually outline these areas. This is from 2000 forward. So the last 2 recessions, notice you can already see in the negative portions of this graph, the blue column and the orange column, which are the spending by households, the blue, the spending by businesses, the orange. When they stack on top of each other negative, we get a deeper recession. The Great Recession is in the middle of this graph, and I'll outline that in a second. This is government spending added to it. This is exports and imports. And if you remember your textbook time in macroeconomics, this is the sum of what we call gross domestic product, these elements together. And here's the graph I just showed you, but as a line graph weaving through those columns. Now, there's the dot-com recession. And you can see that mainly that was a change in business investment or the spending by businesses and not so much the blue column going negative. But in the Great Recession, it was both. And that's where you get really deep recessions, when both consumers and businesses lose confidence, stop spending, and basically the demand side of our economy slowly grinds to a halt. The problem with the business spending going down is it can affect how much we have capacity-wise on the other side of the cycle. And this is where we are just in the first quarter here. Real quick to add to this, this is services consumption. So a lot of consultants, I have a consultancy, deal on the services side of the economy. And that contraction in services is shown here. Most of this, though, for right now is retail, restaurants, and hotels. And that's really what is the drag right now in terms of household consumption. It's not so much goods. We actually are buying slightly less goods, not more, but not as few goods as we are, with services. Services are really right now the drag on the economy. We will see if that picks back up once we open our economy back up. Okay, and there's those last 3 recessions in contrast. As I said earlier, the data for California and all the counties of California, as well as, let's say, the Bay Area as a total, are going to come out here in the next few minutes. What I'm going to show you now is what happened at the national level in April. The data for April for California and the counties are just about to come out. This is what it looks like. So there was negative 12.9% of non-farm employment was lost in 1 year from one April to the other. So comparing last April to this April, 12.9%, an eighth of the workers in the United States lost their job, 1/8. However, if you go to the far right-hand side, workers in leisure and hospitality, hotel and restaurants, almost half of those workers lost their job in the last year, and most of that in the last 2 months. So where the pain in our economy really is in these last really 2 or 3 columns: retail, personal services, including a lot of, let's say fitness, wellness studios and workers, and then ultimately our hotels and restaurants are where we really had most of the pain. So one of the things we're watching very closely is as we emerge from the shelter in place, does that lead to a shift back in hiring back in these industries? We'll see. Here's that forecast I talked about. And so folks, I want to outline this. This forecast comes out every quarter, and it comes out looking forward 4 to 5 quarters and then looking forward about 3 to 4 years. And this is the Philadelphia Federal Reserve does this. These are all public data, by the way, folks. I should have said that right off the top. There's nothing here that is proprietary to me. All this is available from public sources. So, and I think I've got every one of these graphs sourced. That outlined area shows where the previous quarter's forecast was, so before COVID-19, and now what the new forecast is for real gross domestic product. So that graph I showed you with the negative 4.8, the second quarter looks like it'd be negative 32.2, okay? Now that's Great Depression style magnitudes of reduction in productivity. And that's really what that number is what's the percentage change in the productivity of the economy since the previous quarter. And the other quarters you'll see for the rest of the year and also the first quarter of next year are actually historic growth quarters in terms of their magnitude. But when you fall so far, getting percentage growth from a low number is a lot easier than from a high number. So these forecasters are suggesting that quarters 3 and 4 are going to be pretty good bounce back, including quarter 1, but we're going to fall pretty far before that. The New York Federal Reserve does what it calls nowcasting, and every week it updates what it thinks the next quarter's GDP growth is going to be, and it's actually picked up a little bit from this 32.2, which it was at for a little while. So we might see as the shelter in place opens, these forecasts become a little less pessimistic, but alongside of that, this is the unemployment forecast. So you can see they're expecting that at the end of second quarter 2020, we might be at 16.1% unemployment at the national level. Right now, as of April, we're at 14.7. So that suggests we're actually going to peak. And so you see how these things are starting to come together. When the initial claims for unemployment insurance peak, we think unemployment rate is going to peak. They basically are forecasting that peak happening by June 30. That's a good thing. And even in all the negativity, if the duration of this episode is relatively short, that helps everybody. Here's the annual forecast. So we have a negative year this year, which is very similar to the Great Recession. And then we have positive years going forward, still kind of digging out of the hole. And then that kind of begs the question, how long is this sort of slog going to last before we kind of get back to where we started 2020? Well, if you look at unemployment rates, we're not going to be back to right around 4%, basically where we started the year, maybe until 2024. Notice the unemployment rate is still 5.1 at the end of 2023. After it spikes this year, it's that long slog I talked about right off the top. So in essence, economists are now sort of suggesting that we're going to see most of the pain in 2020, but it's not going to be an easy time to come out of it. And we're not really going to be back to where we were as we entered 2020, maybe until 2023 or 4. Okay. And that begs the idea of depth versus and duration. What policy is trying to do is lower the depth and shorten the duration. And that's true of any episode. But what I want to do now is I want to pause for a minute and let people either ask questions or think about this question. Do you feel like that we've done the right thing so far? In the sense that, do you feel like the reactions to everything we've done, have we sheltered in place correctly in your own opinion? Have we started to come out of it correctly? What should we have done different? Wide open. There's no way, folks, on Friday nights with a glass of wine in your hand, you're not thinking about this. Come on now.
So, Robert,
Yeah.
Michael Whatmore here. My concern about shelter in place is the depth of it. And at this point, I don't think we are thinking creatively about how we can bring businesses back, not necessarily to normal, not anything close. But when you consider the technology and ideas that are available to us, surely many businesses could be back functioning. Like I haven't had my haircut in 8 weeks, and it's something that my hair cutter could have a mask on. I could have a mask on. They wipe the place down. Let's get back to work. Some people can.
Agreed. And one of the real pieces of consternation that economists have been talking about for some time as this started is who should really be making the decisions about how businesses open up? Should it be a medical doctor and a set of public health officials? Should it be our elected officials? Should it be an independent body that is appointed by elected officials? Should it be at the county level, the city level, the state level, the national level? So one of the real challenges for our politicians is how do they do that in such a way that if one life is lost based on reopening and not doing it correctly, how do you deal with that issue? And a lot of it is boiled down to that. I have, for better or for worse, been asked to speak on these town halls with our local state senator here a few times. The public health official gets 95% of the questions, but everything is driven by public health. Now, that balancing act is really why we're still in, let's say, a less creative mode, because we're very concerned about the continuing saving lives. So it's very tricky. And I think it's tough to see why we haven't been more creative, but I'll tell you this, once we start to reopen, we're probably going to see a lot of innovation and a lot of creativity to keep those places open, especially if we reinfect.
Hey, Robert, this is a fabulous presentation. Paul Benton here.
Thank you.
Angela and I co-chaired an event on Tuesday, and segueing directly into your point, we had 4 elected officials, and the consensus, Angela will correct me if I'm wrong, their time frame of reopening looks like it's more than 6 months. And my question to you is, what does the economic data tell us? How much time do businesses have before a significant number of those start going out of business and it's just too late? So when is too late? And then overlay that with what the politicians are forecasting for when we'll be open.
That's a great question. And it's also a question we don't have great answers to, except to think in theory that your smaller businesses and the ones that depend on consistent foot flow in relatively dense areas of foot flow are probably the most vulnerable. Then the next ladder up are the medium to larger size businesses that may have national connections to where some of the costs can be rebalanced in other ways to keep them open and wait for the new markets to come back. But our locally owned kind of, sort of hand-wavy mom and pop shops or our locally owned personal services are at most risk, generally for 2 reasons. 1, they don't have great fallback mechanisms. And 2, they generally have not had enough positive cash flow to build up a war chest for a situation like this. And if you combine those 2 forces together, those kind of businesses are at risk. And what that can do is it can change the character of our neighborhoods very quickly if those businesses go away. Mm-hmm. That's what I would say about the timing, is that you don't have any idea because every business is different. But in terms of the ones that are most vulnerable, there's probably a lot of those kind of businesses that have already failed. We just haven't seen it in full yet because the data haven't been revealed. And we're not moving around per normal to observe a lot of commercial real estate vacancies, a lot of anecdotal evidence from people we know that these businesses have gone away, because the businesses are shuttered anyway until we actually reopen in full and we see, okay, well, this business went out of business. This person's now looking for commercial real estate and they want somebody to come in as a tenant. That's when it's going to unfortunately start to reveal. But just theoretically, and it seems like intuitively, those smaller businesses are less likely to have war chests the longer and longer this goes, and may also not have the incentive to go through all the pain and would rather cut their losses and just walk. So there's probably a lot of businesses that have already been pinched out of this because they just don't simply have the financial stamina for much more, especially on the ones that are so-called phase 3. What Michael described earlier, those ones where there's more proximity between you and the service provider.
Okay, we're asking people to raise their hand, and then we'll call on you. So I see, if you don't know how to do that, you hover over the participant list, and in the More button, it'll let you raise your hand. So I see Mike Van Horn has a question. Mike, I'm going to unmute you.
Okay. All of the people that are out of work are concentrated in that right side of the graph you showed earlier: hospitality, restaurants, all the other little services. And those are also the ones that work for all of these small businesses you were just talking about that are likely to go out of business. I think it's going to be much more difficult to get all of those people back to work. They're also the ones that are hurting the most. All of us, we work from home and things are tough, but we're doing all right. If you are you're not able to pay your mortgage, your rent, your car, all of that kind of stuff, you are definitely hurting. It's hard for me to see a scenario where those people are going to be coming back anytime soon, enough to actually pick up the economy. And a lot of those jobs are going to go away. They're just never going to come back.
That's an outstanding point. One of the things we're very concerned about, and I'll talk about this in just a minute, is structural change in our economy as a result of this. So you can have cyclical change, meaning basically the shelter in place created a downward business cycle from which we reemerged with the help of policy. If you have structural change where you actually take the movement of our economy and shift it down to a new structural level, that gap is very difficult to fill without some other positive structural change. And so to your point, we may see a reshuffling of the deck in restaurants, retail, personal services, such that those businesses never come back. And the ones that remain will just simply pick up the slack demand on the front end, such that there will be no need for an expansion of businesses to pick up, because there's not going to be enough demand in the first place to pick up any remainder. So that's one of the biggest fears. And that's why in the graph I showed you before on the forecast, we spike quickly, but then we kind of float slowly back down in unemployment, because it might take 2 or 3 years for us to, in a sense, reshuffle the economy in such a way to actually know who's going to make it and who won't. But to your point, our lower skilled, lower wage workers were not only vulnerable in the first place, but might be vulnerable to structural change. And I'll talk about this later, in such a way that they may have to go back to school or completely rethink what they're doing for work, because the job they had before is not coming back at all. It's an outstanding point you're making, and something, unfortunately, we're going to test over the next 6 to 9 months.
Erica? You had a question?
Yeah, I did. And maybe, Rob, you're going to get to this in the next portion, but, you know, I know there's a lot of speculation that, you know, come the end of this summer, beginning of this fall, will be another round of the COVID where there'll be another shelter in place, perhaps even more severe than this last one. And is that reflected in any of the forecasting that you had just shown?
That's an outstanding question. It is not. So it is there is no double dip scenario out there yet. I actually was, when I was asked to do something like this, and I work with the California Department of Finance team, and I'm going to show you some of those data in a minute. They did not also predict in the end, when they did the governor's budget background, a double dip, meaning that we dip now, we get better, we reinfect, and we have to shelter in place again, which acts almost like a second downturn, and then we finally reemerge after a vaccine. Right now, most forecasters are assuming that one of two things is going to happen, and it's a very tricky balancing act. One thing might happen is that we will get a vaccine sooner than we expect, but almost every single medical doctor and disease scientist, I guess if you want to put it that way, says we're not getting anything until next year that's actually proliferate enough to get to the entire world. So don't start banking on it happening. But the second piece, which I hope happens, because there's a lot of positivity in this, is we see businesses make adjustment, and there's adaptation and innovation and entrepreneurship that come to bear on this, that if we do get reinfected, we're already ready for it in terms of how we set up our businesses, interact with each other, consider how we engage outside, and in a sense mitigate the economic damage that would come from a general reinfection situation. Most economists are banking on number two, because the science otherwise suggests number one ain't going to happen by the end of this year. But if you see that sort of smooth ride down, there wasn't anything in there. There was some quarter out there where we go boop and then back up again and then down again. It's really just sort of smoothly down, because the supposition is that we're going to adapt using, classic American plays. They say, okay, problem happened. We reformat, we figure out what we're going to do, and then we bring a bunch of new businesses to bear on this. I'm actually going to talk about this later in terms of consulting opportunities.
I think we've got one more question. Michael, I unmuted you. Go ahead.
Erica covered half of the question already. The other half, though, is sort of the structural change of how certain businesses work. When you have restaurants that now have fewer customers in them because of the physical distancing, they can serve fewer customers, so they have fewer employees. So those employees aren't coming back because now they have 50 employees instead of 100 employees. And, what is so much of the Bay Area is hospitality and restaurant and travel, but yet so much of it is the upper class of people that get their income from jobs outside, hiring the contractors and so on for work, and that sort of layered economy. So it's hard to tell what exactly people aren't going to be affected and what is the restaurant employees and so on, and the hospitality employees that are going to not have as many employees until there's vaccine. So that follows off Erica's question.
Yeah, and that's one of the biggest concerns economists have, is that we actually are underrepresenting in our forecast the idea that businesses are just going to simply go back to business and continue to sort of invest in the same way. So lower interest rates suggest that businesses are now going to have a reduced cost incentive to basically continue to grow, or to rethink how they're going to grow, assuming that consumers are going to take those low rates and continue to consume and potentially pile up a little bit more debt, because they're going to be excited to get out of shelter in place, and that will help stimulate the economy forward, using the layer of policy to sort of stabilize your economy. The problem, if you have that structural change, there is going to be the swell of people that once unemployment insurance benefits run out, which is another whole ballgame, that the federal government might say, okay, this worked round one to kind of keep people stabilized. We now need to add 6 more months to that because of that structural change. We'll see if that happens in January. If those jobs don't come back, it's going to be very weird to see how our lives change as business people. But furthermore, think about some of these places that derive a lot of secondary and tertiary income from the flow of people. So if you know Half Moon Bay and you think about this restaurant called Mezzaluna, which you may or may not know, restaurants like that are probably easy to convert to a takeout model, but that's not going to do a whole lot for them long term if they don't have a flow of people coming through there and are just simply serving the people that live in Half Moon Bay. They want visitors coming to the coast to eat there, and that sustains a larger fixed cost in their business model to serve the local area. If all they're doing now is serving the local area, those kind of restaurants won't make it long term. And that's also true if you ever go to downtown Napa, same problem. Those restaurants are built on a tourism model where your elasticity of demand is very low. You're going to spend. So here we go. You're going to spend $375 for 2 people on a meal. You're not going to probably do that in mask and gloves. And if you're not traveling, you're not spending that kind of money either. So there's a lot of places in the Bay Area where that structural problem of a shift in the business model is going to affect, in some ways, the long-term outlook for some of these places that rely on the flow of tourism to subsidize the reasons why they exist otherwise for us as business people or the local residents. And we should expect that shock is not going to go away easy. But there are some entrepreneurial aspects of what you can do. If going out in the street, we're seeing a lot more cities allowing that movement for restaurants to keep them alive or allow them to be innovative in how they're going to use their spaces. But that still doesn't mean that costs are suddenly lower. They still need revenue to happen, and that actually is going to increase their costs on the front end. So it's not a clean break no matter what you do. You got to expect more costs as a business, and almost every employer is going to face higher costs.
Rob, I'm curious, do you want to take 2 more questions, or do you want to
move forward? Yeah. If you're okay, let me move forward,
okay.
And then if you have your question, hold on to it for just a minute. I want to get a little deeper in this to give you a little bit more insight. At least hopefully you'll feel it's insight. It kind of is germane to what we just talked about. The things that are being weighed at the public policy level about reopening and sort of this phase process is really the balancing act between these. And I've talked to a lot of public officials who've told me, in essence, these are the ideas. We don't want to get reinfected because we're trying to avoid exactly what we went into shelter in place for. So if we open back up, we still face that risk. In the medium term, the problem is having to shelter in place again. That's that double dip I told you before. We're definitely trying to avoid that, because what we're ultimately trying to avoid in the long run is exacerbating the cost of doing business that we already know is going to rise. So the shelter in place, at least in theory, is ending in an evolutionary way to reduce the cost to society, but also to minimize the medium and long-term damage to businesses. However, it's very difficult because we're living in kind of this 5 to 7 day window that I know my neighbor lost their business. And if we had just opened up 4 weeks ago when there were 7 cases here anyway, we'd all be better off. And that game is really something we're going to debate for years to come about whether or not we should have opened sooner than later and how many businesses would have remained open if we'd done that. But these are the costs of reopening if we do it wrong. on the benefits, we get our jobs and spending going again, and our municipalities start getting their revenue also. So we're sort of pushing away those short-term benefits against the cost now. In the medium term, we're kind of betting, as I said earlier, that if there's a repeat of the virus, it's not as damaging, or we actually get a vaccine. But the key ultimately, and this is the positive part, is that the benefits of getting going now is we can start to adapt and innovate in such a way that we can minimize that damage and, in fact, potentially generate new business opportunities to help businesses minimize the cost of dealing with this over time. So the longer we shelter in place, we don't test those benefits, and that's the public officials are very, very, very concerned about engaging the costs. So when you think about it in more focal light, where are the opportunities? We might see a healthcare manufacturing change that we never thought would happen but for this issue. We might see the federal government subsidize repatriation of healthcare manufacturing from all the way from basic vitamins up to equipment for healthcare. We'll see. We might see shifts in our physical places and how we do work. One of the things that I think is going to come out of this, hopefully, is we're going to see an energy race pick up where we see solar paneling that's as big as my hand. I'm going to show you something like this later. And we all suddenly adapt renewables as a way of, if we're going to be home anyway and I want to take on renewables and I had renewable at work, can I make it at home at a lower price? We'll see. We're going to see commutes change maybe, which is also positive for the environment. But really, it might be, at the end of the day, less time lost in driving an hour and 20 minutes into the city to then drive an hour and 20 minutes home. You're going to have that extra 240 now in front of your computer maybe to be more productive, but your job's got to be portable. How our commercial space has changed. There might be a lot of design consulting that comes out of this of how do I reconfigure my space to conform to this? I don't know. Let's bring in a design expert. On the IT piece, if a large number of people are working from home, does that also change the way that we're using our home as a technology center? And will that lead to a little bit more IT expertise that we're going to need for businesses to make that transition to allow their people to telecommute in ways they didn't expect to do? So there are some opportunities, but like a good little economist, I have to tell you the other piece. That's the opportunity costs. We are going to have some structural shifts. We talked about this before. We have seen a downturn already in the number of auto sales, and we may see that continue. If you're suddenly working from home, you're not going to use your car as much. Are you going to buy as many new cars if you're not using your car as much to commute? It's unlikely. And historically speaking, car sales go along with unemployment. So if there's a long slog of relatively high unemployment, we're going to see some shifts in what happens in auto industry and in energy. How we use our offices, there's going to be a wild scramble in commercial real estate. If you're a commercial real estate consultant, folks, it is going to be a roller coaster for the next 12 or 18 months minimum, because our malls are going to change. Our office spaces are going to change. The one place that might see positivity is R&D flex space or industrial space, but that depends on whether or not manufacturing kicks back on and continues to move forward, and potentially, like I said before, goes through some kind of renaissance on the healthcare side. We'll see. But that long duration of unemployment is the real problem, especially in urban areas. If we don't see some get back there, will we see our urban areas shift also in terms of the ability to gain access to workers back? One of the nasty frictions that we're watching is if I give you enhanced unemployment benefits, does that impede your willingness to go back to work if I offer you your job back? And we're hearing a lot of different movements out of the federal government and the state government about whether or not they're going to cut benefits off from somebody who actually receives a job offer to come back to where they were working before and was on unemployment that pays them more than the wage offer of their previous job. We will see how all that plays out. It's been very bizarre to hear those kind of discussions, but we knew when we heard about the benefits being enhanced and provided over a longer period of time that was going to become a problem in labor markets. Folks, what we're trying to avoid ultimately is a loss of businesses. We knew job loss was going to happen. We don't want business loss. And if the two start to feed off of each other, we got big problems. And job loss happens every one of these scenarios. It's unfortunately the first thing you cut. But when businesses start to go under, that shift I talked about earlier, that structural move down has a higher threat of happening. And when the two start to feed off of each other, that's where recessions get longer. So if you think about the Great Depression and you think about the Great Recession, the reason why the duration of those two problems were so long is not because people lost their job. It's because businesses were lost in such a way that there was no place to rehire the workers that were out of work. It took a long time to turn the corner where the number of businesses that were hiring and or new businesses were actually starting to demand labor again. Okay, So again, while the data are just about to come out or have now come out probably in the last few minutes, I'm going to tell you kind of where we were headed in a couple different ways in California and the Bay Area, or where we think we're headed, starting with the California budget. The May revise is out. It's not very good. We're looking at about $53 billion of deficit from where we actually thought we were going to have a surplus this year before that. And some rearrangement of funds leaves us looking for $45 billion at the state level. Now that's at about $1.5 trillion economy and about $200 or $300 billion budget. But the bottom line is that what that deficit means is that you should expect taxes to go up, probably business taxes over the next couple of years, because the California government's going to look at places to try to make up that delta. And most of the tax code right now is personal income based. So if we have long slogs of unemployment in California, or we're not generating as much income, the state government's going to start looking around for other sources. Now, behind this deficit, and let's say the forecast for next year being relatively nasty, California Department of Finance revised its forecast for the state of California. I'm going to show you two angles. This is the unemployment rate through 2023. So this is what we thought in January 2020. In November 2019, I was part of this team along with the Department of Finance that put together what we thought would happen over the next few years. Pretty much the same thing as the national economy, slow movement, not much change on the negative or positive, kind of gliding into the next decade. This is where they're at now. So the height of the Great Recession was 12.3% unemployment. They're actually predicting by the end of the third quarter this year, 24.5% unemployment, a quarter of the workers in California out of work by the end of September. And then we start sliding down. But different from the national outlook, which has it at about 5.1% national, Department of Finance think we're going to be still above 10% by the end of 2023. Now, I personally think this is overly pessimistic. Especially on the comeback. But it suggests that the data they're looking at and the data they're getting from the Unemployment Insurance Bureau, the EDD in California, a lot of people are out of work, and the people who have lost their jobs will struggle, analogous to what we talked about earlier, structurally to get their job back. What does that mean for the number of people working? I'm sorry, here are the last two recessions. I'm going to show you this again real quick in the next graph too. Here's the last two recessions. It means we're going to lose about 4.5 million or about 4 million people working from where we started the year. So that many people out of work is about a quarter of the workforce. And notice that that is below, which I may be able to show you my cursor, that is below where we were at the bottom of the Great Recession, at just under 16 million workers. And by the time 2023 ends, we'll only be about 1 million workers above where we ended the Great Recession 13 years later. So there's a gap. Notice that delta between the black line and the red line, that is in essence the structural shock that we're expecting, at least from the Department of Finance outlook. And that then gears up the next piece, which let's look one level deeper. What does that mean over the next few years? Well, unemployment is going to slowly go down to 10.6 through that sort of each annual movement. By the end of this year, we're at 20.5% unemployment according to Department of Finance, and then slowly eroding that over time. But the number of workers, this sort of again describes the graph I just showed you, slowly climbing back up versus where we started the year, but still below. That is a nasty, nasty outcome and very similar to the Great Recession. Very similar. And I told you this earlier. I'm going to show it to you by now in industrial look. The blue numbers are positive numbers, or the industries that might bounce back more quickly. The black numbers are the negatives and the ones that are going to probably have problems. Now, if you look at the bottom of this slide, the leisure and hospitality and other services, the things that have already slid at the national level that we looked at earlier, notice that with respect to the end of last year or the beginning of this year, half the people are still out of work by the end of this year in California, and about a quarter are still out of work, a little over a quarter, 3 years later. So the structural change in those kind of businesses are foreseen by these forecasters. And it makes intuitive sense if we think there's going to be a lot of retail and restaurants that are not coming back. Where are those workers going to go? Now, the hope is there's some education renaissance that these folks find themselves wanting to reskill, but there still needs to be jobs on the other side of that for people to want to demand education. Okay. Here's just a quick comparison about what's been happening. This is the same data I showed you earlier, but for California with respect to unemployment insurance claims through, I think it was the 2nd of May. And here's the Bay Area. So there's been a lot of movement. About 650,000 people in the 6 counties of the core Bay Area have lost their job. Okay. Here it is in terms of thinking about what would be the peak unemployment rate maybe based on those data we just saw and how California might evolve. Well, so far the data tell us, and we're going to find out more in a bit, that we might peak at about 17.6% in the city. San Mateo County be a little less than that, more portable jobs, less likely to see job loss. Alameda County, more of a mix, retail, restaurant, services, personal services, a little higher. Contra Costa County, a little higher. Santa Clara County, more like San Mateo County, a mix of San Francisco and San Mateo. Marin County, a little bit more like San Mateo County, but still relatively exposed to retail and restaurants. The Bay Area overall might end up peaking at about 18.3 and California about 21. So this is using the data we know to try to predict if we're at the peak of initial claims for unemployment insurance, have we seen the beginnings of the peak of unemployment rates? We'll see how much this matches what the Department of Finance showed. One big question I get a lot of is housing. So this is through April, and Realtor.com now publishes all of its data at the Federal Reserve. This is Orange County, and you can see that the movement of the listing price of houses have been relatively flat in Orange County, though it's there's been some wobbles here and there, but over the last few years ends up pretty flat, not an enormous amount of growth. There's Los Angeles County picking up recently. Here's California, it's kind of similar to Orange. Here's San Diego. Notice that at the far right-hand side, which I'm about to shade in a minute, they've all started to curl a little bit during this year. One of the biggest fears we have out there is the long slog of unemployment will lead to another housing crisis like we saw in the Great Recession. And no economist is out there who's in housing markets suggesting that that's going to happen yet, because the supposition is that with relatively low rental vacancy and relatively low to purchase home vacancy, if you want to stay in California and there's really no other place that's unaffected by the situation, why would you sell your house, except for the fact you couldn't afford to stay there, based on where would you go? Because if I can't sell my house and go into a rental, which was one of the biggest movements in the Great Recession time where housing prices were dipping very quickly, rentals started to pick up because demand rose because people didn't want to leave California. They wanted to sell, wait it out, and stay in their job. Or if they had a job, they wanted to be at least local for the economy to react. We don't have the rental vacancy for people to move in. So housing economists see the supply and demand conditions that relatively stabilized. But there's San Francisco. So San Francisco actually seen some pretty decent ascension in the last couple of months, with the idea that I think anything that's going on the market, given low interest rates and potentially a swell of people with relatively portable jobs and not losing their job yet, might be trying to chew up anything that's coming on market that might be 10% or 15% below what was expected in the median home price. Now, there's all that. You can see those differences across California with respect to the city being a little bit of an anomaly. Here's growth, just to move through this relatively quickly. These data are as of 2 days ago in thinking about where we've been recently. And you can see Santa Clara County over the last 2 years has dipped a little bit, but the 2 years previous to that, 27% ascension in median home price in Santa Clara County. And all these places have seen growth. We're really trying to think about preserving that housing growth. But it's very tough to do that if people are losing their jobs. So you can think about the gray columns as the ascension of wealth since the bottom of the Great Recession. But here's the forecast. Zillow does a forecast every month of the prices a year forward. So this is the forecast for April to April. And you can see that most of it's negative, but not steeply negative, meaning that they're expecting relatively flat movements with a little bit of negativity for 1 year. I'm going to see if I can show you my cursor again. You can see that there's this movement. I actually put San Francisco in black, Santa Clara in black, so it kind of stands out. San Mateo County is basically flat as a pancake, no change at all. And California is just a little bit negative. So the supposition is that supply and demand for housing is going to pretty much hold hand in hand, but so much of that depends on whether or not people are actually able to get back to work, and there's not an enormous number of new and existing units that come online as we saw in 2007, 8, and 9. Okay. Well, what does this all mean for the Bay Area? Well, once we see the data and we start to reconfigure our forecast based on what we actually now know is the actual data, we should see some reconfiguring in commercial real estate. There's no way commercial real estate is going to avoid some pain in this, and potentially the largest amount of pain on real estate side. We're going to shift the way we work to a certain extent, and in many ways, we might shift it forever. It'll be intriguing to watch how different businesses view productivity when people are not together versus the potential cost of them coming together. That's going to be a real test because there's millions of pages written in economic journals about why offices are potentially more productive than people not working together. We'll see. We should expect restaurants and retail for sure, and potentially personal services to go through some serious structural changes. Losses of business, a reconfiguring of the business model, all that should be coming. We also might see changes in the way we move ourselves around. So Uber and Lyft might find some problems because in places that won't see as much tourism, the demand to keep those businesses in business might sag enough that people will not have enough revenue to keep doing that side hustle. And then finally, to take that one step further, what's positive for some of our rural areas in California is we might see people who would otherwise fly someplace for vacation just want to get out of the house to clean air and utilize our rural places in California more completely to give them a boost on the front end. We will see. We got to get open to know. What's this maybe mean for consulting? I know a lot of you have different ways in which you engage in consulting. If you engage with government, like I do quite a bit, I'm expecting a downturn there as well as nonprofit consulting, because nonprofits are also going to go through some wild changes over the next 12 to 18 months. We should also expect some corporate belt tightening in terms of how they use consultants. However, there may be other cases like I talked about earlier where there's opportunity, reconfiguring space, design, organization, potentially organizational behavior and how people are going to work at distance in ways that they never thought would be true, and who can come in and solve those kind of problems. That's why I have here OB, OD, and leadership. Those are some serious shifts if everybody now is suddenly working maybe part-time remote or full-time remote, or having shifts in the hours they're working to try to space ourselves out in the current commercial real estate. It'll be intriguing. As well as if people are working at home, do you have to do redesign in your home to provide a quiet office space for you to be most productive? It'll be very wild to watch this happen, but I think there are some opportunities out there for consultants. So we're going to stop here again briefly and talk about where do you think are ways in which California and the Bay Area might emerge stronger going forward, given some of the negativity I showed you and also some of the opportunities. Love to hear your thoughts. My impression is going to get more competitive. I mean, certainly we're not going to be alone and just sort of on an island in terms of the demand for entrepreneurship and trying to solve problems for businesses and healthcare on the other side of this. So we might see new places emerge as, let's say, burgeoning areas for innovation that we never thought would come because we're so slow in emerging from this. It'll be intriguing to see if that plays out. And certainly those, what you described have been rumbling for some time. I think for at least the last 20 years, we've been hearing about a movement of Silicon Valley in full toward Eastern Asia. And it just has never quite happened yet, because if you do stay in that 50-mile mass between basically the middle of Marin County and the bottom of Santa Clara County, there is still so much vibrancy on the entrepreneurial side and so much money globally that pile drives in there because the speed at which things get done. It still is a place of basically wild, wild west movement. And until that happens to lag against other places, and this is, I think, going back to sort of the cruise comment you made, there's no doubt that places are recognizing that they need to get more speedy in terms of how they allow business ideas to go from idea to actual commercial ideas. It'll be intriguing to see if we don't see some spring-ups on that. I still think that the United States has more overall flexibility to move quickly and move in scale versus a place like Denmark. I think what Denmark will sort of have in not allow is scaling. And Germany's closer, but Germany's got its own problems in terms of its internal politics and just the way it's looking at business recently. China is another place that still has this, hangover from communism in some ways, that it still hasn't quite shook completely, but they both, Northern Europe and East Asia, both have the potential economic engines to compete with the United States very, very much neck and neck. So we'll see how it plays out. I still think the United States has a good possibility here, but we ourselves have become a little bit more dysfunctional also.
Gloria, you had a question?
No, he answered it. Thank you.
Oh, okay, great.
Thanks, Gloria.
So I think Wendy,
How do we get
next.
the screen back? How do we get the
Rob, they're asking if you can stop screen sharing for a moment so that people can see everybody. And Wendy, you had your hand up. Wendy Richards, unmute yourself. I'll unmute you. There we go.
Great. Thank you, Rob. This was very, very insightful. So whilst you are a government employee, what I'm about to say might go against your personal interest. But one of the bright spots I see is that the local governments are under pressure now to meet very reduced budgets. And I am seeing a renewed, not even renewed, a sudden change politically here in Sausalito to actually sit down and negotiate with our public sector unions. And one of the things that we've seen cycle after cycle is that these drastic downturns have given us a chance to reset things that might have gone overboard. And in my personal opinion, as a taxpayer and business owner, the relationship between public sector unions and the taxpayer has gone overboard. And particularly for small businesses like ourselves, that the business licensing taxes and the tax burdens placed on even home-based businesses have been drastically raised. My taxes here in Sausalito went up hugely in a recent move. And there's finally an opportunity, which unfortunately is resulting in layoffs at our cities, but fortunately is giving the political will to reform our system of taxing and governing in a new positive way that business owners like us are not going to be subsidizing people who are double dipping on retirement, for example. Like, we have this huge opportunity. And I am supporting a council member in some of the analysis of this now. I spoke out at City Council, and I really would like to encourage every single person on this call, and Rob, you as well, to share the voice of the small professional businesses, because we are getting caught up in this attempt to plug the gap by taxing businesses. And they've taken here in Sausalito already last year a broad brush that has captured small and medium-sized professional businesses in a way that is unsustainable and quite unequal, particularly now that with the new labor laws, so many people have home-based businesses. We're all working from home. So I would just like to encourage everyone to really work with our local elected officials and our local staff members to figure out what are the essential services for our government and what is the right balance that we as taxpayers can have with our public sector partners, because it's the system, it's not the people. The people are all doing great work. It's this system that was established long ago. So I just would like to share that with you, Robert, that you keep in mind as you're doing these policies that, oh, well, we'll make it up with businesses. No, we're businesses, right?
Hey, Wendy. Oh, no, 100%. And what I'm suggesting to you is that I think the currently state government, in its internal thinking about where it's going to generate taxes most easily, that's their default mode. You're 100% correct. And it's something, as somebody who is an administrator in a state government agency, I have a mix of unionized and non-unionized personnel, and we march to the union drum very quickly when it starts to beat. So there is, and that slows movement down. And again, everybody does great work, and we totally love our staff. But these crises can lead to more efficiencies if you're willing to do it. The issue is the willingness, where we might see, and so Wendy, your point, because you live in Marin County, the county of Marin was already seeing a gray wave, and this is also true in other county governments around the state of California. Marin County kind of stood out. They claim, and in their HR department, that about 40% of their staff were eligible for retirement last year. So if that now becomes a golden handshake and they switch out of that mode to save costs, that might be what you see a lot of local governments do, is try to provide a cleansing of their labor ranks by providing an incentive to retire if you're eligible. But what does that leave you with in terms of services? And then again, if that doesn't quite do it, are businesses the first pass? And they probably are by the nature of how government generally does business in California. But to your point, it can lead to some weird incentives for businesses to either remain or to grow on the other side of it. I'm assuming that's where you were going. Go ahead, Judy. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry. I wanted to check in with everybody. I would like to let the Q&A continue and take a little bit out of our party time because this is really fascinating. And so I'd like to see thumbs up or thumbs down on that. Okay, let's keep going.
Okay, and Judy, just one thing. I got a hard stop at 5 to 10.
No problem.
So I have another thing I have to get to at 10 o'clock. So I just want to make sure that I let you know that.
All right, we'll go for another 5 minutes on Q&A. Awesome. Paul, you had your hand up.
Robert, I want to answer the question directly, and then that'll segue into my question.
Oh, good.
The answer is, I have noticed that what's positive is people with ideas, new entrepreneurs now, for the first time in a very long time, have talent available to engage with. Previously, the market was so tight, unemployment so low, that everybody was basically trapped in cement unless you had crazily high money to spend on hiring people. So there's a silver lining there. However, the question is, the unemployment is not uniform. If you have a degree in artificial intelligence, you don't even notice that there's something that's happened out there. If you're a SaaS person, you don't know that there's something out there. Can you shed a little light on, the 20% predicted unemployment rate? If you drill down into that, who really is unemployed? Are people with degrees and credentials as unemployed as 20% might suggest? Can you shed some light?
Absolutely. So just thinking about the U.S. level in the 14.7, because most of that is in retail, personal services, and in what they categorically call leisure and hospitality, but really is hotels and restaurants. A lot of that is low wage, low degree level workers, mainly kind of high school diploma level workers, generally speaking, to qualify for those jobs. So there's no doubt that the pain is being felt on the lower wage, lower skill, quote unquote, side of it. The problem with that is that also means there's a gut in spending. So if a lot of us are consultants, like let's say I'm a SaaS consultant, if there's a 15% reduction in demand for the businesses I consult, they might look at my contract and cut it, and then rearrange somebody who maybe has been working parallel to me to do enough SaaS training to be able to fill the gap in the short term, but my contract's going to go away. And that might not happen now. It might happen 6 to 9 months from now, but it might happen in that sort of line that you shouldn't expect that just because most of the pain is being felt on the lower end, at some point, the secondary and tertiary effects of those job losses won't come back to bite some more advanced skill bases on the margin. The supposition is we're going to make the turn, and that belt of people that are relatively well-educated will remain relatively insulated from this. But the longer this goes on, the trickier it's going to be even for those folks to keep either their contracts or their jobs. So, and I've got myriad examples, but I know we're running out of time.
Okay, Michael Watmore.
Just quickly, Robert, this has been very enlightening. My concern is with the vulnerable businesses. And what I think is lacking is that our government agencies could actually be taking steps right now to educate people who own businesses about how they could begin thinking about reopening, rather than sitting at home wondering when the government might say, oh, you can go back to work. And if we spent some time helping people understand how they could do business, I think it would help us a great deal.
At Sonoma State, we've actually had a couple of professors who specialize in entrepreneurship talk about doing classes to do exactly that, Michael, where they would actually say, hey, look, here's your business. Here's what reopening looks like, because now we have the rule book. What can you do to keep your financial situation basically in check, knowing you're going to have to increase costs in these ways? How can you be more innovative in how you look at your business to reopen well, new markets, shifting marketing, and also dealing with this extra cost? We have a couple of professors who want to teach that kind of class in let's say, a certificate-like manner, where like over a 6-week period, they put you through a boot camp of how to do it, not only for the next like 6 months, but really trying to strive for the next 5 years or so, because this might last some time. I haven't seen a proposal yet that I actually like 100%, but they're coming.
I think
We'll
that's
see some of
awesome.
that.
We're going to officially conclude the meeting, but we're going to be able to stay on, but I know Rob has to go. And I really wanted to thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'm going to unmute everybody so we can say thank you.